One of the persistent misconceptions about the Korean War is that cold weather casualties were the unavoidable result of an unusually harsh winter. The deeper reality is more uncomfortable. Many of those losses stemmed from a failure to internalize shelter lessons already learned a decade earlier in Europe and the Pacific. During the Second World War, soldiers, scouts, and resistance fighters survived nights in forests and hedgerows, not because they had tents or stoves, but because they understood how to turn debris into insulation. By Korea, much of that knowledge had faded from institutional memory, with consequences that were both predictable and preventable. If this kind of overlooked continuity in military survival history matters to you, consider subscribing to Backyard Wisdom. This channel focuses on the practical lessons that were learned the hard way, and then quietly forgotten, even when they still work. Why improvised shelter mattered more than fire in World War II field conditions. World War II forced armies to operate for long periods without reliable supply lines, especially during retreats, encirclements, and reconnaissance missions. In these conditions, fire was often a liability. Smoke revealed position light compromised concealment, and fuel was, well, scarce. Soldiers who relied on fire alone frequently exposed themselves to detection or exhaustion. Those who survived learned to prioritize insulation over heat generation. The debris hut emerged not as a formal design, but as a shared solution across theaters. Whether in the Ardennes, the Balkans, or the Pacific Islands, the principle was the same: trap body heat using natural materials and minimize heat loss to the ground and air. This approach required time, patience, and an understanding of local terrain, but it offered something fire could not: continuous warmth without attention. So, during the Second World War, soldiers had to adapt civilian and woodland knowledge, often under extreme pressure. Most of these soldiers, honestly, were not trained woodsmen. The debris hut, for example, only became a real option because troops borrowed techniques from rural civilians, foresters, and partisans, folks who already understood the ins and outs of building seasonal shelters. Now, these influences, well, they were rarely acknowledged in after-action reports. But, they spread pretty quickly at the small unit level, as soldiers shared what they'd learned with each other. The essential insight, really, was that insulation works by stillness, not just by thickness alone. Leaves, pine needles, grass, and even shredded bark could trap air when layered the right way, providing the warmth and protection those soldiers desperately needed. Soldiers learned, often the hard way, to avoid compressing these materials too tightly, since crushed insulation just, lost its effectiveness. The goal here wasn't really comfort, but rather thermal equilibrium, so maintaining just enough warmth to prevent hypothermia while also conserving calories and, of course, alertness. A debris hut's effectiveness was honestly decided long before a single branch was ever placed. World War II accounts repeatedly emphasized the real danger of low ground, where cold air pooled and moisture tended to accumulate. Even just a slight elevation, maybe only a few feet, could reduce dampness and improve warmth quite a bit. Natural windbreaks, like fallen trees, embankments, or dense undergrowth, actually mattered more than being close to resources. Orientation was, another critical factor. Openings were positioned away from prevailing winds, even if that meant a less convenient layout. Soldiers learned to read subtle cues, like snowdrift patterns, leaf accumulation, and exposed roots, to determine wind behavior. These were not just abstract skills, but honestly survival habits refined through trial, error, and loss. The World War II-style debris hut was narrow by design. A low-profile reduced heat loss and, visual detection. Most huts were just large enough to crawl into, forcing occupants to lie close to the ground where insulation was thickest. This was uncomfortable but efficient. Larger spaces required more insulation and, honestly, a lot more body heat to warm. A simple ridgepole supported angled branches, creating a triangular frame. Over this, successive layers of debris were added until the structure, well, resembled part of the forest floor rather than a man-made object. Camouflage was not a secondary concern. In occupied territories and contested forests, concealment was really inseparable from survival. You know, many soldiers at first put their efforts into insulating the walls and roofs of their shelters, only to find that they lost heat really quickly through the ground. The experience during the Second World War corrected this mistake pretty fast. Ground insulation became a top priority, and often they ended up using twice as much material beneath the body as above it. Dryness, honestly, mattered more than softness. Wet leaves, for example, conducted cold very efficiently, while dry pine needles or straw actually provided reliable insulation. Some units got creative and used scavenged materials, canvas, scraps, paper, even emptied ration packaging, as vapor barriers underneath layers of debris. This clever approach prevented ground moisture from wicking upward and, really helped reduce heat loss. These improvisations, actually foreshadowed later military use of ground pads and vapor barriers, though the original lessons were learned under far harsher conditions. Debris huts were not intended for extended habitation, but really for survival during pauses in movement. Reconnaissance patrols and evasion teams relied on them to rest without revealing their presence. Unlike tents, debris huts blended into the environment and required no carried equipment. This capability, it extended operational reach. Units could move farther, knowing they could rest safely without fire or shelter supplies. The psychological benefit was, honestly, significant. Soldiers who trusted their ability to survive the night, they actually made better decisions under pressure and, conserved energy for movement and observation. So, what went wrong when these lessons were forgotten? By the early stages of the Korean War, many units entered cold environments with improved gear, but, honestly, diminished fieldcraft. This reliance on issued equipment created a false sense of security. When supplies failed, or, let's say, conditions exceeded design limits, soldiers lacked the practical knowledge to improvise shelter quickly. After-action reviews from Korea quietly echoed World War II findings. Exposure casualties were often linked to inadequate ground insulation and poor site selection rather than extreme temperatures alone. The debris hut, or variations of it, reappeared in training manuals, stripped of historical context but validated by necessity. Why these shelters still matter for modern preparedness? The World War II debris hut remains relevant because it depends on principles rather than technology. Insulation, moisture control, wind management, and concealment are constants across eras. Modern survival kits can fail, be lost, or even be totally inaccessible. But environmental materials, they always remain. For civilians, hikers, and emergency planners, the real lesson here isn't about romanticizing hardship, but rather about respecting simplicity. The debris hut, for example, really represents a mindset. Use what's available, minimize your exposure, and let physics quietly work in your favor. These aren't just nostalgic ideas, no, they're practical ones. What this history reveals about survival knowledge itself is, pretty fascinating. Survival techniques tend to endure when they're grounded in the environment rather than just following what's fashionable. The debris hut survived the Second World War because it worked, not because it was codified. Its disappearance from popular memory says more about institutional priorities than about effectiveness, honestly. Understanding these shelters as historical artifacts restores their context. They were tools of necessity, shaped by fear, fatigue, and determination. Remembering them honors not just ingenuity, but the countless unnamed individuals who learned, adapted, and passed knowledge forward under conditions that allowed little margin for error. Remembering and understanding these lesser-known survival methods matters because history does not repeat itself exactly, but it does revisit familiar problems. Cold exposure and isolation remain threats. The solutions, as World War II showed, are often already known. If you value this kind of grounded historical analysis and want to keep these lessons alive, subscribe to Backyard Wisdom and share this documentary with others who appreciate depth over myth and experience over assumption.